Hello. Hello to all of you in Portugal and in other parts of the world. And welcome to the Dean's Lounge, an initiative of Porto Business School. The Dean's Lounge is meant as a forum for reflection where the Dean and the Associate Dean of Porto Business School invite distinguished scholars, experts, deans, and colleagues from business schools around the world to discuss issues that are relevant for the future of business, government, the economy, and society. But before we get started, I must tell you something. This session is a bit special because it has been pre-recorded. Normally, this session is broadcast live at 6 p.m. Portuguese time. But given the time difference between Australia and Portugal, we realized that doing it at 6 p.m. would have required our invited speaker to join us at 3 a.m. in the morning, his time in Sydney, where he is based. And I think you would agree with me that this would have been a bit unreasonable. So we agreed to do it at a more convenient time for both of us, which is late here in Europe and it's very early for him in Sydney, but that will work. Okay, so now let's get started with today's session, cultural intelligence and how to relate and work effectively across cultures. The term cultural intelligence is relatively recent. Early definitions and studies of the concept were given by Christopher Earley and Soon Ang in their book Cultural Intelligence, Individual Interactions Across Cultures, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2003. And the concept was further developed by David Livermore in his book Leading with Cultural Intelligence. We can define cultural intelligence as a person's capability to adapt as he or she interacts with others that are from different cultural backgrounds from different regions of the world. It has behavioral, motivational, and metacognitive aspects. It's important because, without cultural intelligence, both business and even military actors seeking to engage foreigners are susceptible to something which is called mirror imaging. Mirror imaging means that you may perceive and process information through the filter of your own experience. And this imposes personal perspectives and cultural background biases on incomplete data, and it undermines objectivity. Mirror imaging has resulted in gross distortions of intelligence, massive oversights, and poor planning in the face of national security threats. Take Pearl Harbor, for example. It seemed inconceivable to the US planners in 1941 that the Japanese would be so foolish to attack a power whose resources very much exceeded those of Japan, thus virtually guaranteeing defeat. And the failure of the US planners to think beyond their own cultural experiences and reasoning allowed for the surprise attack by the Japanese, who evidently held different perceptions of the repercussions of the Pearl Harbor assault. So the point is, when we lack information, we're more likely to look within our own experiences to fill in informational gaps. And this is a dangerous trap, one that we should avoid. Companies too have cultures, and often very distinctive. Anyone who joins a new company spends the first few weeks deciphering its cultural code. Within any large company, there are quarreling subcultures as well. The sales force cannot talk to the engineers, the PR people lose patience with the lawyers, departments, divisions, professions, geographical regions, each has a constellation of manners, meanings, histories, and values that will confuse the intruder and cause him or her to stumble, unless, that is, he or she has a high cultural intelligence. To talk about this, to talk about all these issues, we have with us today nobody else than Chris Earley, one of the fathers, if I may call you so, of cultural intelligence. Chris Earley is the Dean of the Business School at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia, and he has over 25 years of teaching and research experience at top business schools around the world, and over 12 years of administrative experience as a dean across 3 different continents. Indeed, Chris has been Dean of the Tasmanian School of Business and Economics, Dean of the Cranmer School at Purdue University, Dean at the University of Connecticut, Dean at the National University of Singapore. And earlier, he held chairs at London Business School and the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. He also held professorships at the Sassoon Business School in Bangkok, Thailand, in Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, the University of Minnesota, and the Graduate School of the University of California, Irvine, among others. And his interests include cross-cultural and international aspects of organizations, such as the dynamics of multinational teams, negotiation and conflict, the role of faith in organizations, and motivation across cultures. He's the author of 10 books and numerous articles and book chapters. He has also taught executives and consulted with companies such as Nestlé, Cisco Systems, Samsung, General Motors, Unilever, British Aerospace, Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals, among others, in England, in France, in Germany, Hong Kong, Israel, the People's Republic of China, Singapore, South Korea, and Thailand, amongst others. Chris, welcome to the PBS Lounge.
Thank you so much, Ramon. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, these days it's almost inevitable to start any conversation and talk about COVID, the COVID pandemic, which has disrupted so much of our lives and has caused so much pain. So before we get actually to the main topic of our, of our session today, which is cultural intelligence, as I was mentioning, I'm going to ask you to share with us a bit about what's happening in your part of the world. We hear a lot about what's happening in Europe, of course, and in the US. How is it in Australia and in Sydney in particular, where you are based? What about the impact on universities and your school in particular?
Well, this has been tough. First of all, just as a backdrop, behind me in my virtual background is the business school building for the UTS Business School. And it is virtually empty right now. So we've had a shutdown at the university in terms of student and faculty presence, except for those who are absolutely essential. We've moved nearly entirely online now. And we're just, I think, a microcosm of the rest of not only Sydney, New South Wales, but all of Australia. One of the things that Australia did very well and very smartly in the beginning was they took a very aggressive stance on COVID and on getting social isolation in place. Probably the most progressive and I think probably the most successful has been New Zealand. And they were even more proactive than Australia. But both Australia and New Zealand were very, very early on proactive, having children not attend schools, go back learning online, distributing technology for those children so that they would be able to learn online, shutting down non-essential businesses, et cetera. And the result is for a country that has roughly 28 million people, there've only been just slightly over 100 deaths due to COVID in all of Australia, and only several thousand cases of infection. So the country's done very well, but we're still in the same kind of shutdown that you see across Europe, you see across the Americas. And in fact, I would say we're even more stringent now than you're seeing in the United States, which is starting to loosen up probably too quickly, as from what I've seen projections on the news, they're doing new estimates that unfortunately the death rates in the United States are projected to go much, much higher as a result of too fast of loosening up. So in Australia, I think they've been very careful and very prudent to not loosen up too quickly. That said, there are some unique problems in Australia as well. So Indigenous peoples are very susceptible to COVID. So for instance, the New Territories, which has a large population of Aboriginal communities, has been extremely careful on not opening up too quickly, on keeping closed down, social distancing, etc. And the result has been very, very few infections and very few deaths. So I think overall, Australia, New Zealand, this part of the Australasia has been relatively successful in dealing with this and preventing it from being even worse than it could be.
Glad to hear. So let's talk a little bit about yourself before we get to cultural intelligence. You're not the average American, if I may say so. So you clearly seem to be the person who walks the talk. In other words, you have lived and worked in many countries, and I'm sure you have had the opportunity to practice what you preach. So tell us a little bit about that. And as a cross-cultural person who has worked and lived in 3 continents, how has your life influenced your research on cross-cultural issues, and vice versa? How has your research influenced you? Has it helped you in your work, in managing cross-cultural situations? So what is the chicken and what is the egg here, if I may put it in those terms?
Yeah, a little bit, excuse me, a little bit of both. Very early on, I knew I had a passion for international cross-cultural opportunities and interactions. My first cross-cultural encounter was I did a study abroad in Mexico when I was in the 8th grade, and lived over in Mexico, in Guanajuato, for about 3 months. And so even as a relatively young person, I had a fascination and interest in learning about people from new cultures, communities, new ways of doing things. And it just permeated in my experiences. As an undergraduate, I did a program that was kind of like a Fulbright for undergraduates, where I spent 3 months in Ghana, West Africa, and 3 months in England doing research. And that, again, led to then doing graduate work at Illinois, and trying to always tie in some cultural element into the kind of work I was doing. It helped a great deal. I worked with a mentor when I was at Illinois, a woman from the Technion in Israel, Miriam Erez. And Mia was my mentor my first year of graduate school. She was actually on a sabbatical visiting Illinois. And after that, we did a lot of work together. We wrote books together, articles together. I got to know them quite well. I was even in the first Gulf War. I was actually on a Fulbright in Israel, visiting Mia. We were writing our first book together. And so it was a interesting period, but it was a chance for me to really explore what was a fundamental yearning in me, which is to understand and learn more about different ways of life and different peoples. I love to travel, and obviously with the current life situation that the world is facing with the pandemic, that travel has been curtailed quite a great deal. But I think that I really think that some people have a passion for this, and we, those of us who are really impassioned by cross-cultural work will find ways of trying to work with it and deal with it as we can.
In fact, the last time that you and I saw each other happened to be in Milan in the month of February, just 2 months before they shut down. 2 months, 2 weeks.
I was going to say just about a week before they shut down.
Just a week, yeah, literally.
Yeah,
so we managed to escape just in time, so to speak.
Exactly. Although, it is one of those really interesting coincidences of just being at a particular epicenter, in Milan, just shortly before this happened, and we were very fortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move now to the core of our topic today. Of our session, which is cross-cultural intelligence, and I would like to, if you can explain a little bit. You've written books about it and have done a lot of research. Can you give us the crash course, if I may say so, in 10 minutes? What is cultural intelligence and why is it important? You've made the point that it goes beyond emotional intelligence, right? Could you give explain the concept and give some examples, perhaps, for our listeners? To understand.
Oh, certainly. So one of the biggest differences over the years, and especially doing cross-cultural work with managers and organizations, my colleague Sunang and I noticed and observed that you can sometimes have somebody who's a very, very good person, well-adjusted, extremely effective leader in their own culture, but they go to another culture and they don't do well at all. Now, that's not surprising, really. But what we also found, though, was that sometimes you got somebody who is not so good in their own culture, a bit of a misanthrope in their own culture, and yet they go into a new culture, maybe working overseas, and they do extremely well. So it suggested that it wasn't as simple as geez, somebody's very high on emotional intelligence, EQ, that sort of thing, that there's some other things operating when you cross cultural boundaries, you venture into new cultural milieus. So this led us to think about and to propose this idea of cultural intelligence. Now, one thing I've mentioned, you mentioned David Livermore at the beginning. The other person who really deserves a lot of credit in this field is a guy named David Thomas, who's a professor in Canada. And he actually, around this time, within, with the same basic time period that I was doing my work, David was working with a colleague of his doing similar work on cultural intelligence. And in fact, our models are remarkably similar, with just a few exceptions. One or two components are different between the two. And so it's been a concept that's been around for quite a while. The way we frame it and the way we think about it is that we call it the head, the heart, and the body. So the head is what we refer to as cognition and metacognition. Cognition is what you're thinking. Metacognition is how you think about thinking, strategic thinking. So if, for instance, if I could ask you to add two numbers together, you add them together and probably use a routinized way that you're used to having done so. That's a cognitive process. If I ask you to add those numbers together in a different way, using a different strategy, that's metacognition, because it's asking you to go outside the boundaries of what you normally do and thinking of new ways of approaching things. Now, then we call that the head part of CQ, or cultural intelligence. Very important, because it means that you can get into a new cultural context and not only observe that things are different, but also try to figure out why they're different, what their meaning is. So as an example, one of my professors, a very famous cross-cultural psychologist when I was in Illinois, named Harry Triandis, told us a story when we were graduate students. He had gone to a very large public event, and in which there was a large auditorium, open auditorium floor. And he was talking to the ambassador, the Mexican ambassador to the United States. And Harry said that after about 20 minutes, he noticed that he and the ambassador, who were engrossed in a very strong conversation, had moved from one part of the auditorium way into another corner of the auditorium. Excuse me. And what he said is, he later realized, and he thought about it, is from a behavioral perspective, but also a strategy perspective, is that they had been changing their social distance because they're two males, and males in U.S. culture have a certain social distance that's considered comfortable or acceptable. And in Mexico, that distance is about 6 inches closer. And so what Harry said is basically the Mexican ambassador would get closer, Harry would back up, get closer, back up, get closer, back up. He said they danced around the floor for 20 minutes before they realized what they were doing. So he then had to think about, now that's the behavioral part of CQ as well, but he now had to think about how can he deal with this and not have it disruptive to the flow of a conversation. So he said he developed a strategy in his own mind of dealing with people from as if the person was from, he said, another planet. And so he kind of moved away from the norms that he was used to and dropped those norms. So he developed his own strategy in a very simple context to behave so that people were more comfortable. So this also, as I said, illustrates the second part of CQ, which is the body, or the behavioral part. And in some ways, the behavioral part is a very, very difficult one to master as a person, because a lot of your physical reactions and interactions with others are unconscious or subconscious. And so social distance is a good example. How close can you get to one another? There could be other things, gestures, eye contact. A number of years ago, I did some work. I was actually teaching for Islamic Development Bank in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And I had a weekend off and I wanted to go to the market. And someone warned me, when you're in the market, you're going to be mostly seeing women. And whatever you do, please do not make eye contact with the women. It would be seen as threatening and a bit intrusive for an outsider to be doing that, for making lots of eye contact. Well, again, from the West, I'm a Canadian-US hybrid, as you mentioned. we're used to using eye contact as a way of showing engagement, truthfulness, friendliness, etc. So going to the marketplace and averting my eyes whenever I was encountering someone, it was very difficult to do so, and it was very disruptive. I had to get myself trained or try to train myself to be able to do that, not looking at someone and still engaging them with a conversation. So this is the behavioral part of CQ. It can be very difficult to get your body, essentially, the kinesthetics, to coordinate with what the cultural norms are. The third piece is the heart. And this is when we think of cross-cultural issues, more often than not, people think it's all about cultural values. What are the values in your community? Are you a more individualistic culture or community, more self-oriented, or are you more collectively oriented? Do you have a high power distance or a low power distance, etc.? Now, that's part of it. But what we found is another very important part of it actually comes from a very famous psychologist named Albert Bandura, who did a lot of work on what's called self-efficacy theory, or your self-efficacy and group efficacy, your ability to engage and stay engaged when challenged. And so part of the heart is when you make mistakes, and you do always make mistakes cross-culturally, it's inevitable. Do you withdraw or do you continue to engage? And so if you build a frame of trying to re-engage, even though you've made this mistake, then you're more likely to be successful in working more effectively in that culture. Overall, you put these three elements together, and we have a phrase that we like to use, which is often people talk about when in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, that's actually not culturally intelligent. It's when in Rome, do as the Romans would expect you to do, given who you are and where you are. So in other words, you don't try to imitate, you don't try to be one of the locals, because you never will be one of the locals. Anthropologists will spend years in a community trying to understand, learn that community, integrate themselves into it, and they'll still tell you that they're not fully acculturated. Mm-hmm. And so what you do instead is you act intelligently by creating a space where people feel comfortable interacting with you so you can interact more effectively. But you don't, as you said earlier, the mirroring issue, the imitation issue is not cultural intelligence. It's not. It's a form of insincere flattery. So a culturally intelligent person minds their head, their heart, and the body. They integrate, they remember who they are, and they do whatever they can to create a proper, effective communication flow between themselves and other peoples in another community.
I was mentioning earlier the question of the cultures and subcultures in organizations. So if you apply these concepts in an organizational context, what are the implications?
Well, you see that cultural communities are not just nations. We often think of nation states as being the boundary, but obviously you have within any nation, you've got multiple communities. You've got everything from the Northern Germans versus the Southern Germans. You've got First Nations peoples in Canada versus the Anglos that came over from Europe and from the UK. You've got all sorts of different communities. And within that, you can have further breakdowns of communities of common understanding. You've got age groups, you've got ethnicities, you've got religious backgrounds. In organizations, you have functional professional groups. So those with an engineering background may have a different take on things than those with maybe more of a social science background, as an example. Finance people versus HR. Even sales and marketing, which we often think of as going hand in hand, in fact, are often at odds with one another. And so you've got that complexity of functional background, and you have multi-divisional, multi-country organizational forms, M forms of multinationals. So you've got different divisions. So for instance, when I was working with a number of years ago, I was doing a program with Deutsche Bank, and this was actually working in London. And it was a program helping Deutsche Bank work more effectively with their Indian subcontractors on IT projects. So this was with the back office or the technical part of Deutsche. Now, I was working with primarily German and British Deutsche Bank managers. They would have a project, they would send it over to their, at that time, it was a partially owned company over in India. They wait, say, 5 or 6 months for the IT project to come back. It would come back over, and it would seem to have a solution for a problem they never even thought they had posed. So it was completely disjointed. So our job was to work with them to develop a program of helping them better understand what was the nature of not only the Indian culture, but the Indian culture of IT professionals between the ages of 25 and 35. And that was the group that they were working with. And so it was looking at that level of specificity, but helping them better understand demands on these people's time, interests, what their commitments were, what their perspective was towards the Europeans, all of these sorts of things.
So it's more than empathy, right? So and from a communication point of view, what should we take into account in trying to engage with other cultures?
Well, it's a big question and an important question. From a communications perspective, really what cultural intelligence is about is not only creating a better pathway between you and other people from another cultural frame. It's also understanding what your own relative strengths and weaknesses are. Like IQ, CQ, some of CQ is hard, we believe, we theorize, is hardwired into the person. So in other words, there are certain things that you can do. I'll give you a personal example. My spouse, who's also an academic, has very high efficacy, so the motivational CQ. And over the years, she's learned German. She's okay in German. But if you went and watched her work with or interact with somebody from Germany, from Austria, et cetera, German-speaking countries, you would think that she's beautifully fluent in every aspect. And she knows she isn't. But she's willing to engage. She makes mistakes, but keeps after it, and will, in a positive way, moves forward with communication. I, on the other hand, have relatively low motivational CQ in the efficacy sense. So over the years, I've learned some Chinese. I've done a lot of work in China. So I had a tutor and I learned some Chinese. I'm very shy in using my Chinese. And if I use it, people are flattered. They love that I try to use my Chinese. And they, a little bit of a joke when my Mandarin is, we call it mama hoo hoo, which is so-so, horse, tiger. And it creates a positive path, but I'm very, very hesitant to do so because I'm embarrassed I don't do it very well, which is true. My Mandarin is my colleagues call it baby Mandarin. I've got very simple Mandarin that I can speak. But the difference is on a motivational CQ, I would actually be better off if I was more, quite frankly, more like my spouse and willing to engage and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and re-engage. But I tend to be more shy and hesitant. It's a little bit analogous to somebody who's more introverted versus extroverted, if you think about personalities. And so from a CQ perspective, a little bit of that extroversion can be a good thing. Now, that alone by itself, if you think of the ugly American syndrome, or as we used to say when I was in England, the ugly German tourist syndrome, you get the effect of someone who is not understood, so they speak louder and louder. Or they just keep saying the same thing over and over as if somehow it'll magically be understood. Well, that's a pure motivational CQ, but not thinking or the head part of CQ. And so you really need a balance. You need a combination of these things to really be the effective cultural person.
The head, the body, and the heart, as you mentioned. That's right.
Exactly.
Of course, it's difficult. As you said, some of the behavioral patterns are almost reflexes that we have built in our own, I wouldn't say DNA, but our own upbringing, our own, environment. And it's only when you get out of your environment that you begin to realize that the world is different. And I guess people like you who have traveled a lot develop that. So, and that brings me to my next question indeed. How can you actually develop that? How can you nurture, how you can cultivate CQ or cultural intelligence?
Well, it's a difficult thing. I think, as I said earlier, it's a bit like IQ. you can improve on your IQ somewhat through training your mind, for instance. But you're not going to take somebody who's got an IQ of, say, 110 and suddenly make them an IQ of 190. It just doesn't work that way. There are genetic components to intelligence that literally are hardwired into your DNA. With CQ, we believe that's the same thing. But not to the same degree. So there are cultural elements wired into you. Now, how are they wired into you? Is it purely genetic? It may be. There's a field that I've become very interested in the last 5 years, 7 years, largely because of a provost I had when I was in Tasmania at the University of Tasmania's Business School. My provost was a geneticist, and he had done some work on, quite a bit of work on epigenetics. And I think that may be part of what's going on with CQ. Epigenetics essentially are genetic elements that can be turned on and off like a light switch based on the environment. So unlike a core gene, which is with you from the moment of birth, an epigenetic characteristic is one that may be dormant, and then you're exposed to some event or some activity or some stimulus, and that light switch is flipped. And as a result, there is a difference in behavior. I have been playing around with the idea that there may be some of that in cultural intelligence. And so if we can figure out what light switch to flip, you can truly train somebody to go from maybe low in efficacy on the motivational part of CQ to higher on it, lower on the metacognition to higher on it. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to get somebody who is a complete misanthrope, not carrying, low motivational CQ, low behavioral CQ, low metacognition, head part of CQ, suddenly becoming a great leader in all cultural environments. That's not going to happen because there are the hardwired pieces to it. But I do think you can improve it. And so the first step is identifying it. And you measure your CQ. There's some different measures out there.
It can be measured. There are tools, right, for that?
Yeah, exactly. My colleague Sunang and a colleague of hers named Lynn Van Dyne at Michigan State University and their colleagues have developed a whole series of assessments and interventions that one can use. There's also a related bit of work on more of a, rather than cultural intelligence, more of a universal intelligence or a universal cultural adaptation by a professor named Mansoor Javadin. And he's developed a framework on not CQ, but on a related concept. And he talks a lot about different ways to train these things. So there are methods and mechanisms to do so. But I think personally, probably the most important one to me is the metacognition and the behavioral. Those are the two most important elements. And the behavioral takes time and adjustment. I've actually had managers I've worked with who have hired actors to help them learn not how to act and pretend, but rather to make them much more aware of their body, their gestures, their eye contact, their interactions, their style. So it helps acclimate them to the idea of who they are and what they are. They film them. You get feedback on camera on how you're behaving, how you're interacting with someone. And then other people to help them think, again, outside of the box, so to speak, about the metacognition, different ways of addressing the same problem over and over. And it's not so that they can create the 20 different ways that might happen to work, but rather when they get into a new situation, they can create the one new way that's a synthesis, perhaps, of existing ways.
And the question of the switcher that you were talking about before, wouldn't it not be a way of, let's say, exposing people to new, untested situations, untested for them, I mean, that then force them to, behave in ways that they haven't done before, or experiencing environments that they haven't done before. As you said, if somebody's always been in the same place, it's less likely to have cultural intelligence than somebody who is well-traveled and has seen many cultures. So there is a certain learning, it seems, that comes from being exposed to different influences, to different environments, which may be the ones triggering those genes that may be dormant, as you were explaining earlier.
Yeah,
Is that part of the?
I think you're. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's my question. I mean, you think that's how it works?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what's really important is that there's effective feedback when you have those encounters. So, many years ago, there was an interesting study, actually, research study, again by this Harry Triandis professor I mentioned that at Illinois. He and one of his graduate students were looking at people and exposing one group to another group, and he was very interested in in-group, out-group behavior. Are you part of the clique? Are you not part of it? And what they found is he was looking at what was called individualism and collectivism. Now, individualists, again, are people who tend to define themselves on self traits. That doesn't mean they're selfish, but they just. So, for instance, if I'm an individualist, I would say, I am a father, I am a professional, I am a skier. If I'm a collectivist, I might say, I'm a member of my family. I do winter sports with a group. In other words, I'm part of a larger professional community. You define yourself vis-a-vis others around you. So that's individualism, collectivism, group orientation. Anyway, Triandis and his student did this study, and they were looking at if you take people and simply expose them to another community or culture, does that open them up? Just simply having that experience. You take somebody and you put them into a new cultural context, they interact for a time period, and they come back out. Has it opened their eyes to new ways? What they found was that with individualists, it did actually help. Mm-hmm. But with collectivists, they actually found that it, in fact, hurt. That the collectivists would often, in fact, create more of a stereotypic view of the out-group than they had of their in-group. So mere exposure wasn't good enough to learn. And that's where I say, back to your point about, can you learn these things? Yes, but it takes effective feedback and essentially explanation, working you through what you've seen, what you've experienced, and what you've done. So that's why with managers trying to do this, especially executives, I'm always recommending to them that they, in fact, they do these kinds of things, but with a professional coach, mm-hmm. somebody who can actually work with them, help give them feedback, help them understand what they're experiencing, why they're experiencing it. Because otherwise, when you do make those mistakes, and as I said, everyone makes them, you tend to withdraw or get negative about that other community.
That's right. So it's an emotional reaction of the heart, right? If you, yep. Some people will feel I failed, and there you give up, so to speak, right?
Exactly.
And this resilience of saying no, I have to keep going because I think it's important. So there's something to be said there. Can you think in your own research or experience of one big success and maybe one big failure in terms of cultural intelligence and in a business context or management context, organizational context?
A good question. Let's see. I think for a really good success, what I would say is the probably one of the most interesting examples was the program I was working with Deutsche Bank. They had very good success. The IT professionals we were working with, who were the back office operators for Deutsche, were very proactive, wanting to really engage. So they had high motivational CQ for the most part. I was dealing with about roughly 15, 20 people for this program. And they really had the high motivational CQ. What they really needed was the metacognition, the thinking about thinking, the strategic thinking. And what we did is we brought in people who, in fact, one of my good colleagues from National University of Singapore, named Kulwant Singh. He's a professor of strategy there. He knew a lot about outsourcing and smart sourcing. And he came in to actually talk them through in this program in London about how to interact and deal with different supply chains in India. And it helped them develop a larger frame of what supply chain and what supply availability might mean in this community that they weren't used to. And essentially, it helped them develop a larger meta frame for what supply chain, what project management meant, what guidance would mean, what ideation meant, all of those kinds of things we take for granted in business. But they didn't realize that not only was it different in this subsidiary over in India, but they didn't realize how to construct a model of what it could look like. Mm-hmm. Now, as a result of that interaction, Coolant really helped them build a better framing of this. And they were very successful. They went from having this toss the ball over the wall kind of problem to one in which they were then sending projects over and having good success with them. Now, for failure, I'm sorry, did you want to?
No. I mean, failure, you already mentioned the two ambassadors dancing on the floor.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, there's another.
I mean, in a more business-like context.
Yeah. There's a funny one, and this wasn't a tragic problem, but it was indicative of a difficulty you see often with joint ventures and mergers and right. Things of this sort. When I was at London Business School as a professor, I was working with Mercury Asset Management, fund manager in the UK, very conservative, very traditional, kind of old, staunch sort of group. And I was working with an HR manager, and at that time, they were about to go through, and they were actually just going through a merger with Morgan
Stanley.
And the styles of the two organizations couldn't be more different. British traditional financial institution with its roots back, many, many decades. This brash U.S. company, very aggressive, very dynamic, very results driven. And so I went in. I was brought in to do a morning session on cultural intelligence, actually, and how to work in multinational teams. And I was brought into this boardroom, and these were all HR managers, HR professionals. So these were not regular line managers or functional managers. These were HR people who were trained in HR. And I walked in, it was a very long table. And on one side of the table were all the Mercury people. And on the other side were all the
Morgan Stanley
people. And I asked my contact, I said, his name's Chris. And I said, Chris, are you guys sitting this way on purpose? And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, you've got all one organization on one side and all on the other, facing each other like you're in some big negotiation. He didn't even realize that they had done that. They had all just simply sat down. And it had set a tone of we versus them. It was the Brits versus the Americans. It was the young, brash company versus the old, established one. It was the large company, which is
Morgan Stanley,
versus the smaller Mercury Asset Management. It was everything you could imagine not to do in a multinational team. And they were doing it. And these are HR professionals. And I did manage to get them to actually move chairs and to move around. But quite frankly, you could see it was a mindset. And if you follow the history on that, it actually was an unsuccessful merger. Mm-hmm. They ended up breaking apart later anyway.
Okay, all right. Well, you mentioned supply chain, you mentioned the work in India. So that brings me to another topic, which is related to, the globalization question, right? So before the crisis, the coronavirus crisis, the world was already in a mess, experiencing serious social problems and geopolitical tension. So you could say that globalization was already under threat, honestly, nationalism and all strategic considerations. But now with the pandemic, it seems some people, this is the kiss of death, so to speak. I don't know. Maybe you're not so pessimistic. But my question is, what are your views on this? And if globalization is changing, what does that mean for cultural intelligence? Are we, if the world, is it less relevant if the world then becomes less global because we're going to have less of this international trade, international traveling as we had before? How can CQ still be very relevant in a COVID era?
Well, I think what we're seeing is I do think we're on the brink of a very different way of doing business. What we thought of as globalization in the past of an integration, I think what we're going to be seeing here is not so much of an integration, but rather a regionalization. So I think what we're going to see is the rise of regional groupings, even more so than in the past. Now, you had the EU, obviously, as one regional grouping. which is now going through its own kind of growing pains. But you're getting a very big regionalization here, for instance, in the Australasian region. That Australia is an example. It looks much more towards, even though we're having these difficulties politically right now because of the conservative government with China, honestly, China is the big trading partner for Australia. And it's the big power that Australia has to worry about. Even in my own field of education, we're seeing a huge impact on the economy, the educational market, simply because of China. China constitutes a huge amount. Some of the universities and some of the large, very prominent universities in Australia are estimated to lose $600 to $700 million this year because of the market in China essentially drying up because of the pandemic. So we are integrated in a sense. We're certainly codependent. Now, where CQ and things like that come in is we're not only codependent, and that still remains, and I'm convinced it will continue and further escalate, but we're now using remote mechanisms of communication, just like this meeting. We've got, different regions of the world involved right now, different time zones, different ways of life, and a lot of the subtlety of CQ, especially on things like the behavioral part, are somewhat lost or truncated by a digitally mediated communication. And so it becomes even more difficult and more of a challenge rather than less. You need more and better refined CQ than less because of those cues. There is something, we always talk about this with the well, now it's no longer, the millennials are now, I'm showing our age. When we think of the millennials as the younger generation, they're not. They're middle-aged now.
They're in their 30s now. Yeah.
Exactly. Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. Now we think of this very younger generation as being so digitally literate that everything can be done in a computer-mediated fashion. What we're finding, at least at our universities here, is although online is working, it's just not as effective as the social interaction face-to-face, even with a very digitally savvy new generation. And so I think that's part of the challenge as well, is that we're going to have to use mechanisms that give less refined cues for people to learn from, and still you're going to have to learn from them. And so there'll be a new type of, there may be a CQ related to digital mediated communication. I don't know. So I think it's very relevant, but it may take a new form as a result.
Well, it's very relevant. I mean, our own, executive education courses, which is part of our core business, is pretty much affected, of course, by this situation. And people long for the, face-to-face, in-person interaction because of some of the things you said, right? It's people want that, being there, having a coffee, chatting, interacting, walking from here to there, and having an opportunity to talk not just about what happened in the classroom, but about their own businesses and sharing experiences. That networking aspect that happens informally, it's more difficult to replicate in the online environment. So, any lessons from your research then that you think might be been relevant in this new world, or?
Well, I think some of the applications that I later did with the CQ idea involved multinational teams or global teams, and I think this is particularly relevant. And a lot of this work was actually done with a professor, a very successful scholar, who I'm very proud to say was one of my students a long time ago. Her name's Professor Christina Gibson, and Chris is a professor now at Pepperdine in the U.S. Spent a lot of her time actually at University of Western Australia. So she's also a bit of a continent hopper. But we did a book on multinational teams, and we did some work along those lines. And one of the things I think that's very relevant is as we get into more virtual teams and things that Chris actually has written on herself in the past with some colleagues at USC, is looking at how cultural intelligence is interacting with a virtual team. So I think one of the important lessons that's coming out of this that we have to monitor now more than ever is how do you run, lead, and work effectively in a virtual team in this digital mediated context with the cultural boundaries being crossed. And just as an example, one of the successes I've had that I've seen in my own consulting over the years has been, I call it the paradox of heterogeneity. When you think about what's the right mix of people in a team from a cultural perspective, do you want them all very similar? Do you want them half and half? Do you want them all extremely different from one another? What's the right balance of that? And some of the work I did with a professor named Ramon O'Callaghan, we actually looked at composition of those multinational teams. And what we found was that if you have enough time to let people develop together, so several months rather than having to get something done in 2 weeks, that very, very heterogeneous teams, culturally heterogeneous. So in other words, you got a team with 10 people and they're from 8 different countries or 8 different cultures or more. That actually works very, very effectively because you get the decentered thinking from the head part, but at the same time, the very fact that they're so different from one another is a cue that they need to develop commonality rather than focusing on their differences. So we call it the paradox of heterogeneity because if you give people enough time, over time, they stop thinking of themselves as from different countries. They just think of each other as friends or colleagues or whatever. And so what appears to be a very heterogeneous group acts and functions like a very homogeneous one. Now, the added advantage is because they do come from very different backgrounds, they then have different mindsets and thoughts and thinking about products, about how to do delivery, how to do marketing research, whatever it happens to be. And so I always say to people, if you need a bridge built very quickly, get a team of engineers who know how to build a bridge. They can be highly homogeneous, but they're only doing one thing and they're being brought together for that purpose. But if you want a cross-functional team that's going to work more effectively over time, new product markets, new innovations, et cetera, you need heterogeneity, but you need to give it sufficient time that it creates this paradox of homogeneity, the paradox of heterogeneity, meaning that they're very different, but they see each other as common.
There's an element of creativity probably there as well, right? So that
very much.
The heterogeneous group can come up with more diverse ideas and eventually converge in something. So you're better at creating more alternatives than a more homogeneous group, I suppose. So for innovation, as you said, it would be more appropriate to have heterogeneous groups, even if it requires longer periods of time to grow as a team. Anyway, yeah. I think normally at this time, if we were on a live situation, we would pick questions from the audience. Since we're not live, I asked in advance some questions from some colleagues, and I have a couple here that we may want to go through if you don't mind. Here one is that says, do you think that cultural characteristics of a country or a group of people have or may have an influence in the success of the fight against COVID?
I do actually. I do, and this is, again, as a dean, especially a dean of a business school like you and I are, we're not supposed to be political, and so I've got to be very careful about this. But what I will say is that the rejection of the WHO by the U.S., I think, is a big fundamental mistake, and you're seeing that across the world. Bill Gates has come out very eloquently in talking about what the WHO represents and what it can do for us. So I think having the heterogeneity, but again, almost back to my point about the paradox of heterogeneity, the WHO in the US, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC. In Australia, we have our counterpart. I know that in Netherlands, you've got your counterpart. But these World Health Organizations and these country-specific health organizations, over a long period of time, have built a partnership. And the partnership is exchanging those ideas, exchanging those views, best practices, and isolating from that it moves you back into a bad situation. Mm-hmm. If I can just draw from my work I was mentioning on teams, what we found is that this, as I said, the homogeneous team is very good for very short term. Got to get something done in the next week. Heterogeneity is very good if you have time to be able to bring it together in a more effective fashion. The worst situation is where what we found is you have split heterogeneity. In other words, you have 2 or 3 easily identifiable subgroups. You create a we versus them mentality. And unfortunately, that's what we're starting to see in the US in particular, calling out China, for instance, isolating itself from the WHO. It's creating a we versus them mentality that I think is going to be ultimately very counterproductive.
There is a related question, or somewhat related question, or you talk about China. Do you think that COVID-19 will amplify cultural biases, i.e. negative stereotypes about a cultural group? For example, the Chinese virus.
Yeah, very, very much so.
And it's your point, right? So,
yeah, very much so. And this is an example of, again, where you're getting this isolationism. I think you'll find even, so for instance, the United States as a group, we would say they're moderate on individualism, collectivism. The United States is not highly individualistic. It might have been at one point. Probably one of the last few bastions of real individualism is Australia. And even Australia has moved away from it. But the United States is sort of in the middle on that. Now, what it does have, though, is it has very distinctive subgroups and pockets. And this has been exacerbated during the Trump presidency, where you've got clearly a divisiveness rather than a coming together. Now, where that's problematic is when you get this kind of divisiveness and you get these subgroups, you get opportunities for ostracizing particular groups, stereotyping, negativity towards particular groups. We saw that after, I remember I was actually living overseas at the time, so I wasn't in the US, but after the 9/11 attacks, a friend, my colleague I had mentioned, Kulan Singh, from Singapore, Singaporean, who's Sikh, so he's Singh wears the turban on his head, the head covering.
The sheet, yeah.
Yeah. He said that he actually ended up canceling a trip because he had heard news stories in Arizona that Sikhs were being attacked because they were seen as quote unquote Arab. And they were trying to point out, well, it's nothing to do with being Arab. It's because of the head covering. It was assumed. So you got this kind of this groupism going on that was a very negative reaction to particular groups. Mm-hmm. A number of people have called politicians, both in the US and elsewhere, who refer to the COVID as the Chinese coronavirus or the Chinese virus, is saying that's not what we should be doing. That's the wrong way to do it. And I think this is a case where, again, you're creating an artificial we versus them mentality that will ultimately hinder development of effective protocols to deal with this or to deal with these kinds of things in the future.
So one last one, we're reaching really our time limit now, but since I have one last one and we can leave it at here. So behavioral changes in consumers is one of the most important impacts of the pandemic. Can we expect different behavioral changes considering the cultural differences of populations?
Well, this is the funny thing about one of the lessons from CQ is I mentioned about, when we went in Rome, do as the Romans think you should. The other thing about CQ, and this applies also very effectively to teams and multinational context, is the effectiveness doesn't come from looking at our differences, but rather identifying our similarities. Because the similarities are the way that you develop connections and bonds between people. So the more that we think about cultural differences, the more we pull each other apart from one another. The more we think of cultural commonalities. So as an example, if I get a team of managers and I want to try to bring them together, I ask them to think about what is it that they have in common. It may be that manager X has a 14-year-old daughter that's interested in such and such, and another one has a 14-year-old daughter and says, oh my God, at this age, they're so difficult to work with. And it's that life experience that draws them together. And if you think of it as weaving together different pieces of fabric into a tapestry or into some kind of a rug, that's really what you're doing. And so I think if you look at commonality of patterns, one of the funniest ones here that I still don't understand, and I've been in Australia for 5 years, but now we've seen it elsewhere, is the run on buying toilet paper. There was some guy in Australia that went out, apparently bought $12,000 worth of toilet paper. He was going to go and hoard it and then sell it on eBay. Now, this was found out, and guess what? He was stopped, and he now has $12,000 worth of toilet paper. So he'll be fine for the rest of his life, I'm sure. But it's one of the funniest things. Australians went out like crazy and did this, and the shelves were empty on this for quite a while. And I thought, oh God, this is Australia. What a bunch of crazy people, these Aussies. And sure enough, in other countries, you found the same thing. Mm-hmm. So there are certain commodities that people worry about, apparently, and that's one of them, unfortunately.
Some more than others.
Yeah, I guess some more than others. And but again, it reflects a commonality of the life experience. And that's where you build effective teams of individuals, you build effective communities, is not by emphasizing how we're different from each other, but look at the silly things we do in common. And we can laugh at ourselves, and we can use that as a way of building that sense of esprit de corps across cultural boundaries, across national boundaries, and creating a different kind of globalism, I think.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, so much. Let me just conclude, say a few words here. Some final thoughts maybe. And in global markets where international teams, initiatives, and joint ventures, as you mentioned, are common, it is very important for people to integrate themselves in these new cultures. But how is it that some people act appropriately and effectively in new cultures or among people with unfamiliar backgrounds while others flounder? Your work, Chris, suggests that the answer doesn't lie in tacit knowledge or in emotional or social intelligence, but a person with high cultural intelligence, whether cultivated or innate, can understand and master such situations, persevere, and do the right thing when needed. Thus, I guess I should conclude that effective strategies for selecting and training people on global perspective for jobs that require, that type of global mindsets should take into account what you just brought us tonight, which is cultural intelligence. So I thank you, Chris, then for this interesting conversation and exchange of views, and I hope to see you again in other activities organized by our school. So you have a rain check, okay?
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Then, sure, and thank you to all the viewers that are joining us today. And remember that every week, Porto Business School hosts webinars, one on Tuesdays on Beyond Now and another one on Thursdays, this one, the Dean's Lounge. Goodbye and until soon.